This paper is about my understanding of the creation of a new sphere, as it was inspired when I had a Fulbright teaching fellowship, to teach Western thought in Indonesia at an Islamic State university. And I read their Declaration of Independence, which they call Pancasila, which articulates their political philosophy. And right away I could see the connections between systems thinking, Whitehead, Jung, the Greeks, and Pancasila, what the founders of Indonesia were trying to do in the development of their particular country toward a more democratic society, and in particular a society with 88% Muslims that is trying to create a democratic society and avoid the desire to link religion and politics. So I'll read this without elaborating because it will take the whole hour. Contemporary systems science, the relation between religion and politics, the 5 principles of Pancasila, which is their declaration, and the 5 pillars of Islam. In the year 2012, the entire world is engaged in the next most inclusive and most serious era of globalization. We are in the midst of a huge paradigm shift in the way we understand the principles of being, the structures behind the universe, our natural world, human nature, and human culture. People need to grasp the basic principles of the universe as we now understand them, because everything we experience and observe in postmodern culture is the product of recognizing and tapping into the energy of the universe as we have recently discovered it to exist. We need to have some notion of the scientific foundations for the existence of computers and technology, the cause behind the economic side of globalization. Only by understanding this foundation can we create a new civilization that synthesizes all we know about both nature and culture and provides guidance for how we ought to live. We've been living on the foundation of modern Newtonian science. This model has been proven inaccurate and destructive. We must change to the systems view of the world. This paper discusses 3 recent thinkers who all reaffirm the value of religion in our new way of understanding the universe: Alfred North Whitehead, Carl Jung, and Ernst Laszlo. Whitehead calls for a new synthesis of religion and science. He knows human beings are driven by both the desire to find the causes behind the natural forces they observe and the desire to live for the sake of something immaterial, some higher vision. Jung's vision of the individuated person, the fully active and integrated life, is Jung's way of integrating the religious teachings and insights of the past with the clear need for human beings to find meaningful and purposive lives today. Laszlo points out that the new model of the sciences, system sciences, affirms the reality of non-material spheres of nature and culture and the need for people to articulate their values and religious traditions in a way consistent with the system's view. Like Jung, he argues that all the major wisdom traditions have insights that can be and should be shown to conform to the system's view. Under the new paradigm, religion, the social sciences, including psychology, and the natural sciences reinforce each other to a much greater degree than was the case in the era of Newtonian science. With this in mind, I will show that the 5 principles of the Indonesian constitution, called Pancasila, should be understood as one example of a model for political leadership and cultural development based on the system's view of the universe. whether or not anyone who helped create it was aware of that consciously. The principles themselves arose naturally from the history and peoples living in the area that the leaders were trying to bring together into the nation they call Indonesia. The 5 principles of the Indonesian Constitution are particularly important because the first and most important principle is a religious one. Number 1, belief in one supreme God. The other 4 principles connect all other aspects of social and political life to that first principle. Number 2, a just and civilized humanity. Number 3, Indonesian unity. Number 4, a people's democracy led by wisdom through deliberation and representation. Number 5, justice for all Indonesian people. Indonesia's constitution differs from the United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights because its emphasis on religious belief and because it does not use the language of rights to articulate its sense of justice and how to attain it. I will show that the principles are more consistent with the contemporary system sciences than are those political documents written during the Enlightenment, including the United States Declaration of Independence and Constitution, the political documents of the French Revolution, and the United Nations International Declaration of Human Rights. The Indonesian Constitution represents a model well adapted to the worldview behind the sciences and technologies of today. Finally, I will mention the 5 pillars of Islam and how the Indonesians combine a population that is 88% Muslim with a constitution based on religious toleration. This particular aspect of the context within which the Pancasila principles are lived out is, I think, Indonesia's most unique and most important contribution to make to the development of international civilization today. Many Muslims live in nations run by Islamic law alone. If those nations' economies are based on a natural resource like oil, they do not have to adapt to the international globalization and do not have to adopt an international model of culture. They can stay maladaptive and survive. As time goes on, however, and we actually do what we all know must be done, switch to environmentally sustainable sources of energy, the resources and the rigid culture they propped up will have to change also. The nations under Islamic law will eventually be brought into the process of globalization based on system sciences and the system's view of all aspects of culture. The Indonesian constitution and the history Indonesians make in applying it in their overwhelmingly Islamic society will provide an important model everywhere in the world to watch. The entire world needs Muslims to know they can live in a democratic society with all of its freedoms and still retain a very serious, pious Islamic way of life. Indonesia has to teach us that lesson by setting the example. Ernst Laszlo, replacing the paradigm of modern science with a contemporary system science. Laszlo begins, the beginning of the 20th century witnessed the breakdown of the mechanistic theory even within physics, the science where it was the most successful. Relativity took over in field physics and the science of quantum theory in microphysics. In view of parallel developments in physics, chemistry, biology, sociology, and economics, many branches of the contemporary system sciences became sciences of organized complexity, that is, system sciences. And I already have videos about that, so I won't redo that. Carl Jung rejected both determinism, that we are physical creatures who only respond to our environment, or empiricism, and transcendentalism, or Kantianism. that our dignity consists in being aware of ourselves as detached from our material nature and able to act on pure reason, detached completely from emotions and circumstances. In his experience with his patient's dreams, he discovered images and patterns that reminded him of the myths and stories from the world's religions. He claims that babies inherit a deeply embedded structure of consciousness that has formed over the million years of human evolution. Jung defines this underlying structure of consciousness as the collective unconscious and contrasts it with the subjective unconscious that varies with each individual. Jung is not claiming that we are born with specific ideas that determine our behavior. Rather, we are born with a structure that establishes a limited number of possibilities for psychological development. The collective unconscious reflects how our instinctual life has been shaped over millions of years. Whitehead claims that religion is a natural and necessary part of every human life and culture. Modernist scientists and intellectuals who rejected religion altogether and thought its power over people would eventually fade away were wrong. Religion is not simply a non-scientific or anti-scientific explanation for the same phenomena that science has now replaced. Religion is not the accumulation of myths that claim to be facts and that now science has shown to be myths, meaning false. Rather, Whitehead says that religion and science are, quote, the two strongest general forces, apart from the mere impulse of the various senses, which influence human beings, unquote. Further, religion and science, quote, seem to be set one against the other, the force of our religious intuitions, and the force of our impulse to accurate observation and logical deduction. Science is concerned with the general conditions which are observed to regulate physical phenomena, whereas religion is wholly wrapped up in the contemplation of moral and aesthetic values, unquote. Whitehead gives an enlightening example of this seeming incompatibility. Quote, consider, for example, the lives of John Wesley and St. Francis of Assisi. For physical science, you have in these lives merely ordinary examples of the operation of the principles of physiological chemistry and of the dynamics of nervous reactions. For religion, you have lives of the most profound significance in the history of the world. Can you be surprised that, in the absence of a perfect and complete phrasing of the principles of science and of the principles of religion, which apply to these specific cases, the accounts of these lives from these divergent standpoints should involve discrepancies? It would be a miracle if it were not so. Whitehead claims that religion no longer needs to gain legitimacy by trying to make a supernatural god or gods the cause behind events that science has proven to have natural causes. Whitehead claims his new idea of religion provides the opportunity for people all over the world to find new ways to articulate the religious aspects of life. Quote, a release of the religion from the bonds of imperfect science is all to the good. It stresses its own genuine message. Unquote. He calls for a religious viewpoint that can adapt to scientific changes in worldview while retaining the power it has over people and cultures. Quote, religion will not regain its old power until it can face change in the same spirit as does science. Its principles may be eternal, but the expression of those principles requires continual development. And Whitehead thinks about religion this way. Religion is the vision of something which stands beyond, behind, and within the passing flux of immediate things. Something which is real and yet waiting to be realized. Okay, so that would pit it against material science. All right. Then we're back to Jung again. Oh, no, Whitehead describes religion as a body of ideas about the ultimate nature and meaning of the universe and of human life. We inherit these ideas from our ancestors, and this would be consciously, but we must always modify them, or they will no longer have any meaning or influence on human thought and actions. Quote, "The ideas we inherit, they form the tradition of our civilization. Such traditional ideas are never static. They are either fading into meaningless formula or are gaining power by the new lights thrown by a more delicate apprehension. They are transformed by the urge of critical reason, by the vivid evidence of emotional experience, and by the cold certainties of scientific perception. No generation can merely reproduce its ancestors." Unquote. This is more true today than ever, but Whitehead means the worldviews that you parents consciously describe to their children. Jung's view of the collective unconscious as an underlying and unchanging structure to our instinctual lives is not the same vision as Whitehead. Jung brings back religion as a vital aspect of every culture. Let's see. All right. He advocates embracing the old myths and faith tales with a new, non-literal understanding. He argues that religious myths and fairy tales are motivated by the desire to educate the unconscious. And I've talked about that quite a bit in my other videos. Jung argues that the world's religious history and mythology provide the most profound examples of people who have achieved what he calls selfhood. Jung cites examples from very different cultural contexts and periods that nonetheless all refer to a mystical experience of unity within. In Taoism, Buddhism, Islam, various schools of Christianity, and elsewhere, religious seekers claim to have an experience of a higher level of consciousness. Religious leaders such as Buddha, Jesus, and Mohammed are inspiring examples of individuated people. I'd say Confucius also. Further, religious mythology provides stories of the spiritual journey from brokenness to wholeness and examples of the great person, the one who is whole. This inner great person redeems the individual by leading him out of creation and its sufferings back into the original eternal sphere. The whole inner psychic reality of each individual is ultimately oriented toward this archetypal symbol of the self. I could say the same thing in the words of St. Paul. Quote, "Yet not I live, but Christ liveth in me." Or I might invoke Lao Tzu and appropriate his concept of the Tao, the middle way, and the creative center of all things. In all these, the same thing is meant. Ernst Laszlo's description of the implications of systems theory for understanding religion and the religious attitude toward life is also compatible with Jung and the kind of theory Whitehead encouraged future thinkers to set forward, based on the new view of the universe given to us by the sciences. We cannot expect to satisfy all the requirements attached to a worldview in reference to science alone without also drawing on the insights of religion and the values of humanism, says Laszlo. But we can and should recognize that the avant-garde branches of the contemporary sciences are veritable fountainheads for the creation of a non-atomistic and non-mechanistic vision that can fill the need for practical guidance in our time. On the systems view, human evolution does not reduce human beings to mere animals, physical creatures trying to survive. Rather, systems theory leads to the conclusion that human beings are completely unique. Human culture has evolved out of nature, but is a completely different kind of reality. Quote from Laszlo, "Culture is more than a tool of human survival. It is a qualitatively higher phenomenon. Thinking immediately and feeling with clarity and intensity, coupled perhaps with faith and a conscious morality, is qualitatively different from behaviors to assure one's survival and the continuity of the species. Culture and survival functions must not be confused. Our evolutionary history determined that we become a cultural creature, but did not determine what kind of culture we would have. Hence, our problem today is not whether to have a culture, it is what kind of a culture to have. And this requires some serious thought. The kind of culture we inherited from our fathers and grandfathers is beginning to challenge our ability to survive on this planet. If we do nothing more than blindly accept it, we may not have the grandchildren to hand it down to. Values define cultural man's need for rationality, meaningfulness in emotional experience, richness of imagination, and depth of faith. So Laszlo and Whitehead agree on this conscious passing on of values and then having to adapt it, and then Jung talks about the unconscious and having to educate the dark side, the more animalistic side of the psyche. Okay. Laszlo returns to ancient philosophy, Aristotle, to find a definition of human values as the realization of human nature within a broader natural context, unlike the modern paradigm. Aristotle's view is very much like the position of systems theory, Laszlo claims. Quote, "What are intrinsic human norms? The Greeks had an answer. They said that the end of the good life is happiness. Happiness, Aristotle specified, is the fulfillment of that which is specifically human in us. Self-fulfillment, as contemporary humanistic thinkers and psychologists acknowledge, is the end of human purposeful behavior. It is the actualization of potentials inherent in all of us. It is the pattern of what can be, traced in actuality. Individual fulfillment can be a human value, and it can be specified and analyzed in the system's perspective. Our humanistic goal is to enhance individual fulfillment in an increasingly deterministic, multi-leveled society composed of greatly differentiated individuals. Fortunately, this is a feasible endeavor. Unlike all complex natural systems, human institutions and societies function best when they are spontaneous expressions of the freely chosen activities of their interrelated members. Such a society is the norm against which we must measure existing forms of social structure. Laszlo calls for religious thinkers to reformulate old religious concepts in new ways. That's a lot like Whitehead. Ways that fit with reality and also with the basic moral lessons and orientation of all the world's religions in the past. Quote, "Religions would not need to sacrifice or even compromise their cherished tenets to make a unique contribution to this shift. They would only need to draw on their own humanism and ecumenism to encourage creative thinking in regard to the elaboration and extension of their traditional insights. There is obviously a significant humanistic and ecumenical component in every great religion. Judaism sees humans as God's partners in the ongoing work of creation and calls on the people of Israel to be a light to the nations. At the heart of the Christian teaching is love for a universal God, reflected in love for one's fellows and service to one's neighbor. Islam, too, has a universal and ecumenical aspect. Tawhid, the religious witness, there is no God but Allah, is an affirmation of unity, as Allah means divine presence and revelation for all people. Hinduism perceives the essential oneness of humankind within the oneness of the universe. Buddhism has as its central tenet the interrelatedness of all things in dependent co-origination. In the Chinese spiritual traditions, harmony is a supreme principle of nature and society. In Confucianism, harmony applies to human relationships in ethical terms, while in Taoism it is an almost aesthetic concept defining the relationship between human beings and nature. And the Baha'i faith, the newest of the world religions, sees the whole of mankind as an organic unit in process of evolution toward peace and unity, a condition that it proclaims both desirable and inevitable. The great religions could draw on such ecumenical and humanistic elements to nurture a creative elaboration of their fundamental doctrines, supporting and promoting the shift to the new holistic consciousness. So the similarities and differences. Whitehead developed process philosophy, so he sort of redefined theology, created new concepts. Laszlo says you can take the basic tenets of each religion and interpret them in a way that builds bridges between them. And then Jung says you need to educate the unconscious through the myths of the world's religions. Okay, religion can easily be understood in a way that makes it integrated with the system's view of reality. Quote from Laszlo, the key unifying concept could be the spiritual assessment of the universe's progressive self-creation. The vast sweep of system-building processes, from Big Bang to the emergence of life, mind, and consciousness, could be recognized and indeed celebrated by the religions. The recognition of the evolutionary self-creation of humanity and of the larger reality of the cosmos need not be confined to the empirical sciences. The process is all-embracing and has a spiritual in addition to a physical dimension. We bear, after all, written in our own body, the impress of every transformation through which the universe has ever passed. Further, not only our bodies, also our minds are immanent to this process. The forces that brought forth the quarks and the photons in the early moment of the radiance-filled cosmos, that condensed galaxies and stars in expanding space-time, and that created the complex molecules and systems on life-bearing planet, these forces inform our brain and thus infuse our mind. They could come to self-recognition in each thinking and feeling human being. By recognizing and celebrating the world's evolutionary self-creation, religions could promote the process of recognition in each individual. They could celebrate the evolution of the new sphere on Earth as the next and especially significant phase in the world's evolutionary self-creation. The self-creating universe is our larger self, our primary sacred community. Let's see. All right. The view of religion emerging from Whitehead, Jung, and systems theory is that we need a resurgence of religion in two senses. First, at the intellectual level, religious ideas can be and should be integrated with the new model of reality. At the practical level, in the promotion of a certain way of living as the will of the god or gods, we need a model for political life that integrates religion with political power. Okay, after the Cold War, the world witnessed a few years of relief from such a black and white division of the entire world before it set in again. Since September 11, 2001, the world has once again divided itself into them and us. On one side are terrorists, Muslims who live in oil-rich countries, controlled by rulers who maintain their power by convincing their uneducated citizens of the evils of Western society and culture. Westerners blame Islam rather than blaming their own addiction to oil. Westerners will not admit that these bad guys were born from their own greed and believe that they had a right to exploit natural sources around the globe. Leaders of Mideast nations, rich from oil, are happy to reinforce Islamic beliefs by painting it as clearly a superior religion because its adherents are self-controlled and generous. One interpretation of Islam claims that Christianity clearly needs to be replaced by Islam because Jesus died too soon to show how religious life ought to be organized. Jesus did not get married, raise a family, go to work, or exercise political power. Jesus asked people to love God and your neighbor as yourself, but did not give posterity a model of how that love can be exercised in the context of the complications of adult life. Supposedly, Mohammed finished the work by setting a model of how to live a complete life in obedience to God. He was a businessman, a husband, a father, and a political leader. As long as Westerners are indeed materialistic, and even as long as they are perceived to be, Islam will be a strong influence in international cultural life. The animosity between the disciplines of the religions of the book, disciples of the religions of the book, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, as it is being played out in the world today, particularly the confrontation between Israel and Palestine, could easily lead to a world war with untold destruction. Each religious tradition in the religions of the book focuses on blind belief in the different words in the holy books about the meaning of life on earth. Hindus, Buddhists, and Confucians, and all others are supposed to accept behavior that is the antithesis of any authentic religious life, because it is justified by words in books members of these other religions do not accept as having any religious authority, and certainly not the most authoritative religious texts. Even if such a holy war does not occur, the continued use of fossil fuels will lead to wars for resources throughout the world. The colonial era led to wars between the colonial powers and the people they subjugated in order to increase the prosperity of the colonists. The next phase of globalization has and will continue to lead to wars between nations in the context for natural resources, the same motive as the colonial era, unless, of course, we change. The place of Indonesia's Pancasila in the development of a new paradigm for the relation between religion and politics. Everything in this paper thus far points to the great need for Indonesia to further develop the cultural foundation they established in 1945 when they broke away from control by the Dutch. They formed their own constitution and began to govern themselves. The constitution aimed to set up a democratic state, one with all the characteristics of a democracy: elected officials, a balance of powers, free speech, free trade, the rule of law, equal representation under the law, transparency, and all the basic freedoms from government interference. It also began to apply the meaning of equality and equal rights to the development of a public school system, public health care, and all the basic freedoms that require the redistribution of wealth by taxation and the formation of government agencies to run the institutions. Indonesians wanted a society that functioned internally, much like the societies of the colonial powers claimed to function internally. But they did not want to use the categories or worldview of the colonial powers that so oppressed them to describe their own egalitarian social and political life. If you think of it, the Dutch ruled over them and supposedly represent equal rights, and yet that wasn't anything to do with the way the Dutch treated them. So why should they adapt that language? Above all, Indonesians did not want to divide their culture into a public sphere that focused on material prosperity and held politicians accountable only on the basis of whether they were allowing citizens to become as prosperous as their reason was capable of. They did not want to trivialize the impact of religious belief on the ability of citizens to live together well as citizens under a common body of laws. However, they also knew well the power of religious bigotry. They knew the way the Dutch used religious beliefs to justify their superiority, to justify fear of the other, and to justify oppression and violence, which otherwise would clearly go against the commandments of any religious tradition, and also go against the notion of human rights. Instead, Indonesians did what Whitehead, Jung, and Laszlo recommend. They redefined the relationship between religion and politics, and they developed a new paradigm for what religion means. As Whitehead, Jung, and Laszlo all recommend, they focused on the most universal, humanistic, and ecumenical aspects of the 6 dominant religious traditions in their nation. They wrote a constitution that assumed any citizen who adhered to the real spirit of religion in any of those traditions would live together peacefully with people from another different tradition. They even included Christianity, both Protestant and Catholic, the religion of their oppressors. They wanted to make clear to their citizens that everyone else that they could distinguish between the real message of Christianity and the perverse way it was abused by the Dutch and all the colonial powers to maintain and even increase their power. They distinguished between the essence of religion and its great value to human culture and the perversions of religion and their great harm. Religion is a highly complex product of human culture. It arises from the human need for meaning and purpose, over and above the need to survive. Okay. Instead, the Indonesian model is one which should be called spiritual humanism. Whitehead's, Jung's, and Laszlo's positions are also types of spiritual humanism. Indonesia is on the forefront, then, for developing a new model for human culture and politics in the age of system sciences and the next wave of globalization. Indonesians have chosen to show to the world that religious belief leads or can lead inevitably to justice, beginning with principle number 1, belief in one supreme God. The Constitution claims that the other 4 principles follow inevitably from such a belief, as long as that belief includes Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Islam, Protestant Christianity, and Catholic Christianity. Principle number 2, a just and civilized humanity, links the tradition of humanism to belief in God. There is no opposition between the religious understanding of human nature and the human condition and the affirmation of our humanity. The Bible story of Adam and Eve, accepted by Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, has often been used to justify authoritarian governments. People are assumed to be sinners by nature. Hence, they must have authoritarian leaders and institutions, especially political ones, to keep them from destroying civilized life. They have to be taken care of by someone else, someone with power. The United States Declaration of Independence avoids the issue by making a brief reference to God and then focusing on natural rights. It is primarily a document consisting of modern reasoning using material evidence to prove that the King of England was a tyrant, and therefore they were justified in rebelling against England and setting up their own government that supposedly protects their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The U.S. document is a very secular and materialistic document, using the criteria of scientific method to provide sufficient evidence to justify revolution. Principle number 3, Indonesian unity. This implies necessarily that Indonesians will protect each other and create one unified state, even when they belong to all of the world's great religions. Muslims will live together with Hindus, Buddhists, Confucians, Jews, and Christians. This is not a document based on religious toleration, in the sense of the willingness to put up with people that you think you know are wrong, just for the sake of maintaining social order. Rather, Panchasila shows that unity between members of these religions is a religious mandate. One cannot be an honest member of any of these religions without desiring the well-being of members of all the others, and without desiring to convert them to one's own religion. Number 4, a people's democracy led by wisdom through deliberation and representation. This principle points out that no one religion makes its believers superior to others. No one religion can be used to justify a disproportionate number of members of one religion gaining political and social advantage over others. People vote for who they think will rule best. They should not base their vote on the candidate's religion. If the country is 88% Muslim, chances are that the majority of elected officials will be Muslim, but there's no natural or necessary connection. The people are being educated to talk to each other about a candidate's experience and track record as evidence of his or her ability to rule well. Unfortunately, as happens everywhere, too often the determining factors include friends with the money to pay for campaigns and other ways political life is corrupted. The point, though, is that Pancasila, the Indonesian constitution, trains people to focus on what matters. The corruption cannot enter because the constitution itself promoted favoritism, even when religion has so often been used to proclaim one's moral and political superiority, and hence one's competence as a ruler. Number 5, justice for all Indonesian people. This principle points out that religious life cannot be separated from social and political activism. Claiming to believe in God necessarily means treating other people justly. One cannot claim to love another person without also voting for leaders who structure and run their institutions so that collective goods and services, including money, education, and health care, are distributed to all and according to what each needs. Unity, principle number 3, represents a basic trust and goodwill between citizens. Justice, principle number 5, implies follow-through from goodwill to good institutions and policies. In every way, therefore, the ideas set out in the 5 principles of Pancasila are all parts of a whole. The whole is a new model for culture, as Laszlo defines culture. Laszlo says that in a time of crisis, cultures need to re-examine the underlying basic values and structures of the universe as a whole and human culture within it, and have to reframe their entire culture to respond to the crisis. Laszlo points out that culture is a holistic level of reality that goes way beyond the mere need to survive. The human race could destroy itself and nature as we know it. The model of Pancasila goes a long way to prevent 2 of the worst threats to global self-destruction: human arrogance toward nature, the worst sin in any religious tradition, and the confrontation between Islam and the 2 other religions of the book, Judaism and Christianity. Another great contribution of Indonesia to international culture is the implicit union of the 5 pillars of Islam with the 5 principles of Pancasila. It is no accident that there happen to be 5 main points in the Indonesian constitution. The first pillar of Islam is Shahada, testifying to God's oneness. The declaration, quote, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet," unquote. The Constitution was clearly designed to imitate, but also clearly differ from, the first principle of Islam. While Pancasila makes clear that 6 world religions are considered equally legitimate in terms of belief in God, The Constitution also makes clear that the spirit of the Indonesians should be very much like the true religious spirit of any human being, belief in an ultimate first principle that gives life sacred and ultimate meaning and purpose. Whitehead, Jung, and Laszlo could all agree to this basic principle, while not believing that what is being referred to is a personal God, much less the specific God of the Islamic faith. All of them, however, would be happy to live in a culture that follows the principles of the Panchasila Constitution. The second principle of Islam is prayer, salat. Muslims are required to pray 5 times each day. The principle and the behavior connected to it should be applauded by anyone who is concerned with the development of culture today. Prayer is a continual reminder that there is a power beyond human beings. Today, one might think of that power as the force of nature that drives toward higher and higher levels of complexity, as Laszlo does. One might think of the power of the unconscious, which acts as a power that gives life meaning and feels like a power beyond oneself, as Jung does. The Muslim view of God and the need for prayer is probably most like Whitehead's view when he says that, quote, religion is the vision of something which stands beyond, behind, and within the passing flux of immediate things, something which is real and yet waiting to be realized. The immediate reaction of human nature to the religious vision is worship. The vision claims nothing but worship, and worship is a surrender to the claim for assimilation, urged with the motive force of mutual love. The vision never overrules. It is always there, and it has the power of love, presenting the one purpose whose fulfillment is eternal harmony. The worship of God is not a rule of safety. It is an adventure of the spirit, a flight after the unattainable. The death of religion comes with the repression of the high hope of adventure. Unquote. The world's people should hope that the high hope of Indonesians is that their constitution and the way of life it inspires among Indonesians will give other people inspiration to create their own versions of spiritual humanism as a foundation for political and social life. The Arab Spring has given many nations with overwhelmingly Muslim populations the opportunity to fashion their own political documents. Hopefully they will turn to Indonesia for inspiration and guidance. And this paper was written right after Arab Spring, and obviously it hasn't quite turned out real well. Okay, the next principle of Islam is zakat, giving charity. No society can survive unless the citizens are generous. Plato and Aristotle went so far as to describe greed, the desire for more than one share, as the worst political evil. This desire leads inevitably to a gap between the rich and the poor. The rich have no limits to their desires and have the power to structure the society to serve them, even though the institutional structure might be officially democratic. No structuring and restructuring of institution or electing and re-electing of leaders in all sectors of society will lead to justice and goodwill unless people are generous. All major religions condemn greed. It makes sense to connect religion with politics in this way. The modern paradigm assumed that the promotion of hard work and prosperity would cause all boats to rise, that when some prosper, their prosperity will trickle down to everyone else. Plato, Aristotle, and the great religious leaders knew this was folly. It will only create animosity and distrust between the rich and the poor. The next Islamic principle, number 4, is fasting. No society can survive unless the citizens exercise self-control in relation to the physical pleasures such as hunger and sex. Hunger, especially, is continually with us and must be kept under control. The habit of fasting, remind citizens that they depend on God or the universe first, and then upon the culture as a whole to provide food. Fasting reminds citizens to avoid excess consumption and even and desire excesses. Self-control in relation to physical pleasure is internalized. The habit of fasting could never be required by political leaders, but it does strengthen the moral character of citizens, which improves their ability to think clearly about how to organize their society and how to distribute limited resources, especially something as fundamental and immediate as food. The last principle, number 5 in Islam, is Hajj, pilgrimage to Mecca. This requirement links Indonesian Muslims to Muslims around the world. They could engage in dialogue with other Muslims from Islamic societies governed by rigid Sharia law. They could compare their society with more authoritarian Islamic societies from the point of view of people who live there and can relate their experiences. This is the only chance for people who would otherwise never get out of their countries to find out about the Indonesian tradition. Muslims from the nations that are now making the change from authoritarian to democratic societies could get information and inspiration from Indonesians who are on pilgrimage in Mecca. The gathering of Muslims from around the world in Mecca should be applauded rather than feared by Westerners. It is more likely to lead to an increase in humanistic and ecumenical Islam and a decrease in authoritarian and intolerant Islam. Well, hopefully, one never knows. Conclusion: Indonesia's place on the world stage. Indonesia, like any other nation, cannot save the world alone. At the moment, Indonesian development is taking the same self-destructive route as is still the dominant model throughout the world. The exploitation of natural resources for corporate gain and increased national prosperity. Indonesians know the problem with this model, however, because changes in the Earth's climate hit them directly. Very few Indonesians would deny the reality and destruction of climate change. Very few would deny that human behavior is a large factor in the destruction of the Earth's Gaia system, and that the situation can change if human behavior changes. There are 2 islands that are having to be evacuated by Indonesians because of the rise in the ocean's levels, and in the last 20 years, Indonesians have lost 40% of their forests. So I think they know what's going on. Indonesians know enough to connect their religious lives to respect for the Gaia system. Hopefully they will be able to control the direction of their development and find a way to prosper economically without the continual exploitation of natural resources. China, India, and Western nations are the greatest consumers of what Indonesia has to offer. At the moment, Indonesia cannot afford to turn them down. Either the world's culture will change, or everyone will suffer. Indonesia is not wealthy enough to lead this aspect of the process. Indonesia has made its contribution to the wellspring of ideas. Ideas based on the new view of reality are the source of change. When power and wealth begin to be more affected by the system's view, when exploitation of natural resources begins to cost money, not just quality of human lives, the change will occur. These changes will be justified and retained over time because they are rooted in the best worldview humanity has yet developed. Indonesia, then, can be understood as one country at the forefront of the development of ideas about religion, politics, and the relationship between them. Other nations have to be at the forefront of the economic side of development.